Medieval queen's darkest secrets: power, lust, and torture exposed. Behind every crown of gold lies a shadow of blood, lust, and betrayal. Tonight, we step into the forbidden chambers of medieval queens. Women who ruled not only through power, but through secrets so dark they were never meant to see the light of day. For centuries, queens of the medieval world were portrayed as symbols of elegance, piety, and loyalty. But peel back the gilded veil, and you will find a reality far more disturbing. In courts ruled by intrigue and whispers, queens were not merely consorts or ceremonial figures. They were players in a deadly game of survival. Their beauty could be a weapon, their desire a scandal, and their ambition a curse that unleashed both passion and cruelty. Medieval Europe was a stage drenched in shadows. Behind tapestries and stone walls, courts became arenas where lust and politics entwined, where forbidden affairs sparked wars, and where betrayal was punished with fire and steel. These queens, exalted in public, yet feared in private, carried secrets capable of toppling kings and kingdoms. Their lives remind us that history is not just written by victors, but carved into flesh by torture, scandal, and silence. In this episode, we will uncover the most chilling confessions and darkest truths from royal courts. From queens accused of adultery and witchcraft, to those who orchestrated brutal tortures in the name of power. Their stories reveal how the female crown was never free from peril. In a time when a whisper could mean death, queens balanced on the thin edge of reverence and ruin. Some were accused of betraying their vows, their bodies scrutinized as evidence of sin. Others wielded their influence with iron will, turning dungeons into theaters of cruelty, where enemies and rivals met their fate in unspeakable agony. And yet, for all the horror, their secrets continue to captivate, because in every scandal lies a glimpse into the hidden truth of power itself. This is not the history you learned in school. This is the raw, unfiltered darkness of the medieval world, where queens became prisoners of their own desire. Pawns in games of lust and politics, or tormentors cloaked in velvet and steel. As you watch, ask yourself, were these women victims of their time, or architects of their own downfall? Welcome to Medieval Queen's darkest secrets: power, lust, and torture exposed. Queens and the sin of desire in the medieval imagination. The queen was supposed to embody purity, obedience, and divine order. Her body was not her own. It was seen as the vessel of dynastic continuity, the sacred bloodline that would carry kingdoms forward. Yet in a world dominated by the church's moral grip, any hint of desire from a queen was treated not as human, but as sinful, a scandal that could unravel the very legitimacy of her crown. Desire in the medieval court was a double-edged sword. To love passionately was dangerous. To be accused of lust was fatal. Queens found themselves under constant surveillance, their every glance, gesture, and relationships scrutinized by courtiers, eager for gossip, and enemies waiting for an excuse. What might be seen today as harmless affection could in those days be interpreted as adultery, treason, or even witchcraft. Take, for instance, Isabella of France, the so-called she-wolf of France, married to King Edward II of England. Isabella was trapped in a loveless union overshadowed by the king's notorious favoritism toward his male companions. Rumors swirled through court that Isabella sought comfort elsewhere, and when she eventually allied with Roger Mortimer to overthrow her husband, their bond was painted as the product of illicit lust. Chroniclers of the age eagerly branded her as sinful, a queen corrupted by desire, and her legacy was forever tainted by whispers of scandal. But Isabella was not alone. Across Europe, queens who dared to step beyond their prescribed roles were judged harshly. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was accused of infidelity during her marriage to King Louis VII of France. Though the evidence was thin, the accusation was enough to fracture their union and justify her eventual annulment. Eleanor would later marry Henry II of England, wielding immense influence. Yet the shadow of alleged desire clung to her reputation, painted by hostile chroniclers as proof of a dangerous and unruly spirit. In these stories, lust was not always real, but it was always useful. Two enemies, a queen's supposed sin was a weapon. Adultery charges could delegitimize heirs, strip a queen of her crown, and destroy her alliances. In a court where power was fragile, desire became a pretext for torture, trial, and even execution. Even queens untouched by scandal were not safe. The Church's teachings branded female sexuality as inherently dangerous, a gateway to sin. The medieval queen, exalted in ceremony, yet shackled by morality, lived under the constant threat of being reduced from sovereign consort to sinful temptress. When the Inquisition swept across Europe, accusations of witchcraft became a convenient way to expose and punish sinful women. For queens and noblewomen, this meant that even rumor alone could ignite a fire of suspicion that ended in the dungeon or at the stake. And so, the medieval court became a paradox. Queens were expected to inspire loyalty, bear heirs, embody chastity. Yet at the same time, they were ensnared by the constant possibility of scandal. Their private lives were public property, their bodies subject to judgment, their passions weaponized against them. The story of queens and desire in the Middle Ages is not just about sex or scandal. It is about power, the fragile balance between love and duty, between private longing and public expectation. To be accused of lust was to risk everything: crown, body, and soul. For some queens, desire became their undoing. For others, it was a mask their enemies used to destroy them. Power behind the crown, intrigue, betrayal. In Torture, of Chapter 1 revealed how queens were haunted by the shadow of desire. Then Chapter 2 takes us deeper into the labyrinth of power, where queens themselves wielded influence in ways both cunning and cruel. The medieval court was not only a stage for scandal, but a battlefield of survival. Behind jeweled crowns and velvet gowns, queens became architects of intrigue, manipulating allies, betraying rivals, and at times, presiding over torture as instruments of authority. One of the most formidable queens to embody this balance of power was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Beyond the rumors of lust, Eleanor understood the mechanics of rule in a world dominated by men. As the wife of Henry II of England, she maneuvered her position to secure lands, arrange alliances, and guide her sons in rebellion against their father. Chroniclers depicted her as dangerous and cunning, not merely because she sought power, but because she dared to wield it. While her enemies vilified her, Eleanor's legacy endures as proof that queens were far more than silent partners. They were political strategists, capable of reshaping kingdoms. Yet not all power was exercised through diplomacy. For some queens, the dungeon was as much a throne as the court itself. Consider Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, whose strength defined the bloody wars of the Roses. Margaret became the true leader of the Lancastrian cause, orchestrating battles and exacting vengeance upon enemies. Accounts describe her as ruthless, sanctioning brutal punishments against captured foes. In a time when weakness invited ruin, Margaret's resolve was forged in iron, and cruelty became her weapon. To her allies, she was a warrior queen. To her enemies, she was a tyrant cloaked in silk. But queens did not only command torture, they also endured its proximity. Within medieval courts, betrayal was everywhere. Trusted advisors could turn informants, and servants could whisper secrets that reached the ears of inquisitors. The machinery of torture became both a threat and a tool, used to silence dissent or extract confessions that bolstered political plots. A rival noblewoman might be accused of treason or witchcraft, dragged into a dungeon where pain would force her to implicate others, sometimes even the queen herself. Intrigue was a double game. To maintain their crowns, queens had to weave webs of loyalty, while cutting the strings of betrayal. Alliances were sealed with marriages, yet poisoned with distrust. Every feast, every chamber, every whispered promise could mask a dagger. In this atmosphere, queens were forced to rule not with gentle grace, but with ruthless calculation. Mercy was a luxury they could seldom afford, and so power and torture became entwined. When a queen sanctioned cruelty, it was seen not as her choice alone, but as the extension of royal justice. Yet history remembers her not as a monarch upholding law, but as a woman corrupted by ambition. The paradox of power haunted them all. To survive, a queen had to be strong. But to be strong, she risked being branded monstrous. These tales remind us that medieval queens were not mere victims of their time. They were active players in a world where betrayal lurked at every turn, and torture was the language of fear. They were loved, hated, admired, and condemned, not for being powerless, but for daring to claim power in a world that demanded their silence. The queen on trial, witchcraft, scandal, and public shame. If desire marked queens as sinners, and power painted them as tyrants, then accusation was the weapon that could bring them to ruin. In the medieval world, a queen's throne was never entirely secure. When political tides shifted, even the most exalted woman in Christendom could find herself dragged into the spectacle of public shame, accused of witchcraft, adultery, or treason, and placed on trial before the eyes of the world. One of the most infamous examples was Anne Boleyn. Though she lived at the dawn of the early modern era, her fate echoed the medieval pattern. As Queen of England and wife to Henry VIII, Anne was accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. Her downfall was swift, her trial a stage-managed performance where evidence mattered less than ambition. Anne's body became the battleground of politics. Her supposed sins used to sever her marriage and her head alike. Though centuries later, her story reveals the medieval truth. When a queen was inconvenient, scandal was the weapon of choice. But the medieval chronicles are filled with earlier tales just as haunting. Queens accused of witchcraft were not merely judged for their actions, but for their very nature. A woman who was too clever, too ambitious, or too politically active could easily be branded as unnatural. And in a culture steeped in superstition, unnatural meant dangerous. Trials of noble women often blurred the line between theology and politics, where charms, potions, or even miscarriages were twisted into proof of sorcery. Public shame was as effective as the axe. Queens and noblewomen accused of adultery were paraded before the court, their bodies humiliated as evidence of sin. In France, Queen Marguerite of Burgundy was condemned for alleged affairs during the infamous Tour de Nesle scandal. Stripped of dignity, imprisoned, and disgraced, she became an object lesson in how quickly the image of a queen could be turned into that of a sinner. Even without execution, such trials destroyed reputations and erased legacies. The trial of a queen was rarely about truth. It was theater, a performance staged to reassure subjects that justice was done, while in reality it masked ambition, betrayal, and political necessity. Torture was often used not on the queen herself, but on her supposed lovers, confidants, or servants. Their screams provided the evidence needed to condemn her, their broken confessions filling the silence that her own dignity refused to betray. For the medieval queen, scandal was a prison with no escape. Even innocence offered little protection. A mere rumor could fester into an accusation, and an accusation could end at the stake. Whether guilty or not, her trial revealed the darkest truth of the medieval court. That power was never secure. And the higher a queen rose, the more perilous her fall became. These trials remind us of the fragility of reputation, and how medieval society wielded fear as effectively as swords. The queen, once crowned in splendor, could be transformed into a symbol of sin and corruption with a single accusation. And the spectacle of her downfall was not only meant to destroy her, It was meant to remind all who watched that even the most exalted were not beyond the reach of shame, torture, and death. Power, lust, and the Gothic legacy of queens, from whispered rumors of forbidden desire to the ruthless games of power. And finally, the public trials that stripped away their crowns, the stories of medieval queens reveal a haunting truth. Even at the height of authority, no woman was safe. To be queen was to live on a knife's edge, adored as a symbol of divine order one moment, and condemned as a temptress, tyrant, or witch the next. Their secrets, whether real or fabricated, were weapons. Lust could be twisted into scandal. Power could be recast as cruelty. Ambition could be branded as sorcery. And once those accusations took root, they spread like fire through a court eager for blood. For some queens, like Isabella of France or Eleanor of Aquitaine, their legacies endured despite the shadows. For others, like Anne Boleyn or Marguerite of Burgundy, shame consumed them, leaving behind only cautionary tales carved into chronicles. What makes these stories endure is not simply their tragedy, but their mirror. They reflect the contradictions of a world that both exalted and feared women who wielded influence. Queens were meant to be perfect, chaste, obedient, noble, yet were thrust into a world where survival demanded cunning, strength, and at times cruelty.
Oh.
When they rose to the challenge, history painted them as monsters. When they faltered, history erased them. But perhaps their darkest secret was never lust or power at all. Perhaps it was the unspoken truth that their crowns were never fully theirs to keep. In every court, their lives were shaped by forces larger than themselves. Kings who needed heirs, priests who sought control, nobles who schemed, and mobs who hungered for spectacle. They were at once sovereign and prisoner, rulers of kingdoms, yet captives of fear, and yet their shadows still linger. The ruins of castles, the hushed corridors of old cathedrals, the forgotten dungeons beneath stone walls, all whisper of their struggles. Even today, we are fascinated by their scandals, enthralled by their mysteries, haunted by their fates. Medieval queens remind us that power is never without peril, that secrets can be deadlier than swords, and that history often punishes those who dare to defy the roles it demands. As we close this chapter, ask yourself, were these queens victims of their time, trapped by superstition and politics? Or were they, in their own way, visionaries? Women who refused to remain silent, whose defiance left ripples we can still feel centuries later. One thing is certain, the crown was never just a symbol of glory. In the medieval world, it was also a curse, heavy with desire, sharpened by betrayal, and forever shadowed by the threat of torture.